All right, so now we're at part C. So we have y equals the sine of 3x plus pi. So first we're going to do our amplitude, which is going to be 1 because there's no number that is in front of sine. Okay, and then we are going to find our period. So our k value is going to be in front of x. So our k value is 3. Okay, so again, our period is going to be 2 pi over 3. Now we're going to find our phase shift. Okay, so we're going to factor out the 3, which means we're doing pi divided by 3, okay, which is going to be negative pi over 3. Okay, all right, and then I also showed you here what the 1 period would be. So if you start at your phase shift, and then you do the phase shift plus the period, okay, then you're just going to add those together, and you'll get pi over 3. Alright, so if we add those, that's pretty easy to add. And this is my finished graph. Obviously, I'm going to go through that with you. But you can look and see at negative pi over 3 to pi over 3, they're at the same point. That's going to be one cycle of your sine, which sine has one little hill, one little valley, so we're good. Now, if you wanted to check that for this, it's at negative pi over 6, and then it's 2 pi over 3. So at 2 pi over 3, those are going to be your same points as well. So your phase shift is negative pi over 6 to negative pi over 6 plus 2 pi over 3. So negative pi over 6. If I added those together, common denominator would be 6. So this would be times 2. So 4 pi minus pi would be 3 pi. So it would be 3 pi over 6, which would be pi over 2. So look, from negative pi over 6 to pi over 2, that's going to be 1 period. Okay, and the same thing from 0 to 2 pi over 3. You can see that those are the same as well, but any period is going to be the 2 pi over 3 units. Alright, so that is your 1 period. If you're graphing, that's going to be 1 period for our graph. Okay, and again, we are going to make our table and then go ahead and shift it. You can also, for this one, I'll show you how you can just plug them in and use the table to do that. So like if you wanted to see what was happening at negative pi over 3, you could plug that in here. So if you plug that in, you'd have y equals, so this is actually the second method I showed you. Alright, so if you plugged in negative pi over 3, you'd have the sine of 3 times negative pi over 3 plus pi. And then here you would have negative pi plus pi is going to be 0. The sine at 0 is going to be 0. So that would be your actual point on the graph. And you could just plot that point. Okay, so this is different from the shifting. Then if you wanted to see what happened here too, this is halfway in between. What's halfway in between pi over 3 and 0? So cut it in half, it would be pi over 6. So if you wanted to see what happened at negative pi over 6, you could plug that in. So negative pi over 6 times 3 would be negative pi over 2 plus pi would be pi over 2. So this is really like the sine of pi over 2, and the sine at pi over 2 is going to be 1, which is why our value here is 1. Okay, and then you could keep going. So if you plugged in 0, this would be the sine of pi. The sine at pi is going to be 0. Okay, and then again you could do your pi over 3. If you plugged in your pi over 3, 3 times pi over 3 is pi. Pi plus pi is 2 pi. So the sine at 2 pi is going to be 0. So you could plot that there. Now, if you just had this point, this point, this point, and this point, you would know because we went up here, we'd have to go down here. Once you graph a full period, it's just going to keep repeating itself. Okay, so then we'd have to go up to the same level If you look in between the two maximums, halfway in between is going to be the minimum. Halfway in between those is going to be 0. Halfway between the max and the min is going to be 0 again. Okay, and then so here's some good values you could start with on your table. I showed you a few more, a few others of them. But if you were plugging in values and you kept on getting 0, you'd have to find out where your max and min are. And that's where using some of these values would come in. Now again, you still could do your original table and then you could shift it. But because our phase shift is pi over 3, when you're doing your values on your x-axis, you're going to start with pi over 3. Now for this one, I decided to go every other one is pi over 3. So this would be 1 pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, 3 pi over 3, which is pi. And then really I have these in between them, which is pi over 6, which is fine. It's just if I'm going to shift something over, if I am trying to shift over the 0, instead of just going 1 unit when I shift it over, I'd have to be going over the 2 units, okay, the 2 spaces on my graph. Okay, but either way, those are both valid ways to get your graph. All right, good job.